as far as painting the world as grim, you don't really learn much from the good things that happen to you. All classical literature has to do with things that happen to people they would really rather hadn't.
See no evil.
No, he really was a Nazi.
Yeah. He was a Nazi.
Morality of mathematics.
Yeah.
And you say, well, that's just kind of goofy. Goofy.
They're paid
Kind of goofy.
to see
Kind of goofy.
unforeseen.
I guess ultimately you have to ask yourself the question that if philosophy is not concerned with how you should live, what in the hell is it concerned with?
McCarthy and Lit Bros, you can feast for the first time on this channel because we are talking about Judge Holden from Blood Meridian today. And if this was the Cormac McCarthy subreddit, I would just say the judge is the devil and get 1,000 upvotes and everyone would go crazy. But instead, we are going to look at how Cormac McCarthy was the biggest nerd of all time, everyone. Let's
Nope.
just start there before we get into all the weird shit I know you guys obsess over when it comes to Judge Holden. And don't worry, we're going to go deep on the historical, philosophical, and psychological implications of Judge Holden. But let's talk about Cormac McCarthy's obsession. We love to romanticize McCarthy as this manly man and this genius writer, but when he was researching Blood Meridian, he would get in his old pickup truck in El Paso and drive to a library probably 7 days a week and go through thousands of documents on historical accounts of what happened in the period of 1800 to 1860 or 70 in the American Southwest. Most of you guys don't even have the patience to finish The Orchard Keeper, and McCarthy forgoed all the rewards of being a great author. Do you guys not think that he could be getting his dick sucked in Knoxville, being like, I'm the Knoxville OG writer, look at me? He could have, but he forgoed all of that and moved to El Paso and dweebed out while researching Blood Meridian. And I'm sure, as you guys know or maybe don't know, Judge Holden was actually a real person. And McCarthy found out about Holden through General Samuel Chamberlain's memoir. And Chamberlain rode with the Glanton gang and came across this weird dude named Judge Holden. And we're about to see McCarthy steal a lot of content from Samuel Chamberlain, not just what the judge looked like and acted like, but certain events, like even the end where the kid and the judge have a confrontation at the end of the book. Great writing is about getting good at sentence structure, everyone. McCarthy is so good at sentence structure, he can write for a page and a half and use only 3 commas and not a period. There is an infinite amount of content out there for us to write about. Everyone has a book or an idea for a book in their brain. And Samuel Chamberlain describes the judge as the second in command, now left in charge of the camp, was a man of gigantic size called Judge Holden of Texas. Who or what he was, no one knew, but a cooler-blooded villain never went unhung. He stood 6'6" in his moccasins, had a large fleshy frame, a dull tallow-colored face destitute of hair and all expression. His desires was blood and women, and terrible stories were circulated in camp of horrid crimes committed by him when bearing another name in the Cherokee Nation and Texas. And before we left Frontieres, a little girl of 10 years old was found in the chaparral, foully violated and murdered. The mark of a huge hand on her little throat pointed him out as the ravisher, as no other man had such a hand. Though all suspected, no one charged him with the crime. So Chamberlain's physiological descriptions don't just match McCarthy's, but the judge's interest in young men and young women, and also his sort of whimsical nature and immortality, because Chamberlain is alluding that Judge Holden has gone by many different names and changes his identity depending on where he is, and that he almost gains this folklorish energy to him when he goes around these places and people hear like, dude, there was this bald 6'6" dude that was going crazy in the Cherokee Nation, but now he's down here in the Chihuahua Desert with the Apache and he's Judge Holden. In another instance, Judge Holden got a young Pima Indian girl, and Chamberlain says, quote, he proceeded to take gross liberties with her person. However, Holden isn't just some random maniac killer. That's not what makes him interesting, because there are a million guys like this in history, right? Just random psychopaths. Psychopaths, that's a pretty good anime. And Chamberlain says of Holden, quote, Holden was by far the best educated man in northern Mexico. He conversed with all in their own language, spoke several Indian lingos, at a fandango would take the harp or guitar from the hands of the musicians and charm all with his wonderful performance, and outwaltzed any poblana of the ball. He was plumb centre with rifle or revolver, a daring horseman, acquainted with the nature of all the strange plants and their botanical names, great in geology and mineralogy, in short, another admirable Crichton, and with an all-errant coward. Not but that he possessed enough courage to fight Indians and Mexicans or anyone where he had the advantage in strength, skill, and weapons, but where the combat would be equal, he would avoid it if possible. I hated him at first sight, and he knew it, yet nothing could be more gentle and kind than his deportment towards me. He would often seek conversation with me and speak of Massachusetts, and to my astonishment, I found that he knew more about Boston than I did. And guys, this is really scary stuff. When the psychopath is charming and can play music and can connect with you about the things that you connect about, that's at a totally different level. And I don't know if you guys have ever met people who are like this, but it is insane. I've met a couple through academia, and I'm sure some of us feel like this because when you become well-read and like you actually spend your time wisely, not just like on Instagram all day, you suddenly start passing everyone around you. So then you're at the party with a bunch of sleepers and you're the odd one out. Like the other week I went to, guys, in the pursuit of love, we all make mistakes. We all do things that we know are bad ideas. And I got invited to this party, and I already knew that this was going to be bad. Like a second date at a party, and this party was taking place at a doggy daycare, like in like the barn place where they let the dogs run around all day. And I get there and it smells like piss, guy, like so bad. And I can tell everyone there is just a massive sleeper. And the first lady woman I sit and talk to is super weird. And she tells me that she is one of the best rat breeders in the country. Anyway, I felt like Judge Holden at that party. I knew everything. I knew this. I knew more than anyone else about anything other than rat breeding. But I'd like to think of myself not as a psychopath. And another problem Judge Holden brings up is that I always talk about on this channel how reading can open your heart chakra and change your life, and education's the way to heal the world. But there are some people, when they learn about Nietzschean ethics and they start to understand morality, they take the evil side. When they have the choice. Some people say, screw it, I don't care if there's any karmic consequences, I'm going all in. And if we kept everyone in dumb fable, religious, and mythology land, we might be able to prevent that. But when everyone suddenly has a choice between natural law and moral relativism, let's just be honest, a lot of people are going to pick moral relativism. And most lit bros I know that are, into the more natural law side are just like one blowjob or bad influence away from going full moral relativism. Should be a tagline. I should put that at the front. We're all just one blowjob away from being Judge Holden. Anyway, back to Chamberlain's description of the judge. Chamberlain says, quote, Glanton proved that he was well fitted to be the master spirit of the fiendish band. Drinking deeply, he swore with the most fearful oaths that we were all sinners bound to eternal perdition, that it was his mission to save us. He then knelt down and, in well-chosen words, prayed with all the fervor of a hard-shell Baptist for the salvation of all. Suddenly, he sprang up and, drawing his revolver, opened fire on us right and left. One of the Canadians received a shot in the leg as a gentle reminder to flee from the wrath to come. Judge Holden seized the madman in his powerful arms, laid him down, and soothed him as a mother would a fretful child, and Glanton sank into a drunken. And at Jesus Maria in Blood Meridian, when the town scenes, Glanton starts open firing on everybody when he's really drunk. And then Glanton is really drunk, and he kind of lulls Glanton to sleep. And he's speaking to him in this low voice. And we can also kind of see this in the scene with Robert, the idiot, when he is trying to drown. And the judge, this is a sort of symbolic baptism, and the judge pulls him out and is, speaking to him in these low tones. So another scene that is very important and very historical is that they were all at the Yumas, including Chamberlain. What a guy Chamberlain is, hanging out at the Yuma Ferry grounds. And after the Yumas attack, they come back to the site, Chamberlain and a couple others. And the judge is there fighting off 4 Yumas, and they help, drive off the Yumas, and they help Judge Holden. But at some point, Judge Holden steals Chamberlain's horse and is riding off into the distance, and basically he's leaving him there to die, which once again sounds very reminiscent. A bunch of people, walking through the desert and the judge. And As the judge gets ahead of him and is rolling away, he says to them, calling back, quote, "You cursed robbers and murderers, I go to the settlements to denounce you. You shall hang in California," end quote. And this is actually very interesting because after the first scene in Blood Meridian with the kid and the judge out there after the Yuma, what happens to the kid? Oh, he goes and finds himself in jail in San Diego. And so what actually happened, though, is that eventually they retake the horse and they leave the judge in the desert and he's pursuing them. And Chamberlain says that they didn't gain any ground, that they were riding on horse, but the judge kept the same distance behind them and was basically walking just as fast on foot as they were on horse. And eventually they reach a settlement and they wake up one morning and Judge Holden is there with them and cracking jokes in the morning and laughing with them like nothing even happened. And before we transition out of this historical segment of the show, there is also another random account of Judge Holden from someone totally else who meets this guy named Judge H and he gets imprisoned with the judge. And eventually they are lined up to get killed by like a firing squad. And the judge gets shot in like the shoulder and is wounded and escapes. It gets out of this like situation and flees through the desert and ends up living. Eventually these two like link up later. And this kind of aids to McCarthy's idea that he says that he will never die, this idea of immortality, because multiple times, seemingly in his life, he just keeps getting away with death, or excuse me, not dying. Sequential society now, we can't perform violence or really do anything without consequences anymore. And so Holden activates our active imagination and the tyrannical archetype within our soul because, of course, even if we don't want to admit it, the idea that reality itself is war is how war movies continue to just sell blockbuster, sell time and time again. That's how nation states convince us to go to war. There is a romanticization of it, and there has been forever. And this nihilistic attitude that McCarthy is giving us is at some level downstream of his idea of the indifferent universe. Anyone who spent time out in nature understands how indifferent nature is. And so the human animal, if we remove meaning, purpose, and value, which Blood Meridian does, tends toward more violent action. And Cormac McCarthy scholar Vereen Bell calls McCarthy's nihilism ambiguous nihilism because he gives us all of these questions but then provides no answers. It's somewhat Socratic, and he says, quote, "With McCarthy, ethical categories do not rule, and moral considerations seem not to affect outcomes. So the actions and events are defined by caprice and incomprehensibility." And so I would say that's a pretty good interpretation, but we're going to go deeper by bringing Nietzsche into this because, Nietzsche is the king of nihilism. And so when we examine the metaphysics of Blood Meridian, there is a hierarchy, but at the top of the hierarchy is nature, is objects, is the material world, while the secondary aspects of Blood Meridian are the characters and the plot and the morality of it all. And this is shown through one of the most famous quotes and used quotes from Blood Meridian by scholars. And it goes, quote, "That terrain of all phenomena were bequeathed a strange equality, and no one thing nor spider, not stone nor blade of grass could put forth claim to precedence, and a man and rock became endowed with unguessed kinships." So if this whole world is equal, if the rock and the stone and violence and nonviolence are equal, then good and bad, the categorization of those also do not exist in the metaphysics of Blood Meridian, according to McCarthy. And this is obviously the axiomatic foundation of the judge's moral relativism, but it's much more absolute than that because the judge also isn't just like a moral relativist Dumbo at a university who's on antidepressants and has no agency in the world. This guy has all the agency. He is, as we were talking about earlier, the one, this man of total ability, and no one can escape him. The kid, that's kind of the plot, if we want to call it, cannot escape the judge. And this is kind of where we get to the judge is the devil part of the presentation, and that the judge is representing, kind of the archetypal energy of evil. Because if he is in it in its purest form, then everyone around him are students of that. And in this environment, they are basically linked forever with him because they are taking actions with them. If you are a random citizen, you're not really tied to the actions of the United States government. But if you go out and you wield a gun and you join the military, then you are metaphysically tied to the political philosophy of the United States. But what's nice about this novel is that like the kid is not some like opposite. You know, you hear this all the time, and I say this all the time. Like good novels need like dyadic qualities, and there needs to be contrast and parallelism. But in Blood Meridian, we have the judge, and he's the ultimate personification of evil. So then who's the good, right? We're supposed to have this good. But the kid is also raping, pillaging, and killing. Everyone else is too. Even the Mexicans, the Comanches, the Apaches, the judge, the random hermit, Reverend Green, like everyone's screwed up. And through the kid's eyes, we see how individuals cope with a nihilistic world because the kid is the only resistance to any of the evil in the novel. So with Nietzsche, finally, we have two different types of nihilism. There is an active nihilism and a passive nihilism. And if you guys want a more eloquent British, European depiction of this, go check out my interview with Patrick O'Connor on Cormac McCarthy. He wrote a great book on all this. Anyway, nihilism in its psychological form can make you more passive in reality because you can't garner any meaning from the world. You become too focused in what we could call an analysis paralysis of the subjectivity of everything in reality. And we're seeing this a lot now with our nihilistic culture. You know, a lot of people in social, with the loss of value systems and the social fabric in our society, and with the addition of technology and all the narcissistic machinations of all that, we have this large group of people now who have just totally checked out of society. They've lost their total agency in the world. And it's because they see no purpose in the world. They see there's no purpose of what they can do and what they can change, even though you can literally, as a human being, like, create a lot of alleviation of suffering in your life, even if you aren't talented. Like just with a little bit of extra effort, like you can get like tangible objective benefits out of life through helping people. And so that's a pretty easy concept to understand. But then when we look at someone like the judge, there's this very active nihilism. And the agency of active nihilism is really weird because Nietzsche calls it and describes it as, quote, "We wallow in some supreme form of domination and administration." And so someone that takes a role in active nihilism becomes the Ubermensch, the Superman. But if you become the Ubermensch or the Superman, or like think you're doing that, you are just becoming a false prophet, a god. You are embodying that energy. And obviously, if you throw out all the moral principles and value systems of reality and you activate yourself, then you're going to be able to run over people and bring people along with you on a journey. A Journey Through the Southwest, Blood Meridian movie coming out in 2065. And this embodiment is the antithesis of what Nietzsche calls self-narcoticization, which is so funny that he was basically saying that like people, when they realize this, like a lot of people just take the comfortably numb Pink Floyd pill. I mean, the whole hippie movement. That's why I made this channel. I want to be the Ubermensch. No, like I want to not be passive with all the knowledge in my head. Like a couple of years ago, I'd known this for a long time, but I was like, I'm done. I've read 2,000 books. And what am I doing with all this with all this novels, with all this knowledge? There are so many people, you listening right now, you have way too much shit in your head that you haven't done anything with. And we don't really need the dumb people to become geniuses. We just need the smart people to fulfill 50% of their potential with all the knowledge they have in their brain. And people ask, where do I start? Literally just start. Do something. And I actually we're going to actually throw up what passive nihilists do. This is what they have. They have cruelty, hatred of the prosperous, obsession, mechanized living, petty indulgences, mystical escapism, and tribal fanaticism. That literally sounds, if I've ever heard a description of Reddit and like the literature knowledge scene on Reddit, I mean, that's it. Or like just anything, a whole incel culture, you know, just that whole group of individuals. It's funny here, I did not really mean to do this, but I'm like making a sales pitch here for active nihilism. Stop being a passive nihilist and join us active nihilists. And so the two dichotomies of this philosophy is that passive nihilists view themselves as basically limited. They have limiting beliefs. They view themselves in very narrow ways. But the Ubermensch, the active nihilist, sees that this isn't the last iteration of human consciousness because we evolved from monkeys or whatever, the Anunnaki, wherever we want to go with all that. And are we done? Are humans stagnated forever? Is this the end of evolution? Can we evolve again? Can we go through something like the doubling of brain size in 10,000 years or whatever that anthropological thing is? How do we do that? Is it the stoned ape theory? Or is it through us taking as much autonomous action in reality as we can? And it's so interesting. This is why I love Nietzsche. Like, he's so on point with so many different things. Like, a lot of people, you just have to read him. And like, when you read him, like, damn, like, this guy is right. He says, like, it's like a personal development seminar now. He says the number one thing, though, that's holding people back from doing this is what? It's courage. Because a lot of people don't have the courage to transcend all these values and structures, to be the one to say to your family, I'm not going to be a Mormon anymore, or I'm going to do this or that. And that's what Judge Holden is embodying. I mean, he is obviously just the most courageous person that you can imagine. I mean, he is out there just not caring about his life and fighting people and engaging in fights. And so now we actually have to talk about how Nietzsche and Judge Holden actually differ, because I've been talking about like, oh my God, Nietzsche wants us to all just be deviants. But no, if Nietzsche had this book called The Will to Power. And the will to power is basically self-preservation, the drive for all sentient beings to self-preserve. And Holden gets caught up in basically the barbaric aspect of self-preservation. That's all he cares about. He is just all about self-preservation. But Nietzsche calls for, once again, as I talked about earlier, the evolution of man. And that requires us to not be a bunch of scalp hunters, to take things to the next level. Real persistence and self-preservation requires something greater. You could see this in Dune with the Golden Path, not to spoil anything if you guys know what I'm talking about. That's the greatest example in literature of self-preservation. And that was rooted in violence, but it was rooted in something much greater. And the judge and the kid are existing in reality beyond good and evil, and are one of the same mindset, because the judge says, quote, to the kid, I recognized you when I first saw you, and yet you were a disappointment to me. Then and now, even so at the last, I find you here with me. And so now we're kind of existing in this dichotomy of Nietzsche's idea of beyond good and evil, because if the whole world is chaos, as McCarthy and is indifferent, and that leads us to just being these violent apes out here killing each other, then how can we actually create justice in the world? That's the question that Blood Meridian is really trying to ask us. How can we? And someone was asking me, because I kind of say this like offhand sometimes. I'm like, Blood Meridian's an anti-violence novel, because it always makes me ask that question, like, how can we exist in this just world? This unjust world. How do we create justice in it? And it prompts a lot of big questions that I think, lead to like an anti-violent mindset. And so if we really want to now take all this knowledge that we have, is the judge actually an active nihilist? He actually might not be, because at the forefront he is. He's putting his agency into the world, but he really is actually one of those incels. He's one of those kids that never got it all out, and he's a passive nihilist. He is, as the Reddit bros would say, really more of a devil figure, of a psychopath with ability, rather than the Ubermensch, than the Superman, because the evolution of humans, someone activating themselves, doesn't look like that. Why does the judge destroy everything that he records, or any markers around him? Well, it's because he is trying to get away from his own nature. He has a terrible need to dominate the story of his whole life and reject chaos. Once again, much like one of these kind of crazy kids now who are just way too in their head, they're trying to control everything about themselves. And the judge is doing that. And through his raping and pillaging, he's actually trying to avoid reality. The reason that he's out there scalp hunting is because it's an easy way not to self-assess himself and not to look internally. I mean, what's a better way than that? Why is Judge Holden so into geology? What is the geological significance? Because what geology is just about the control of the land. Why does he use feces and urine to create the gunpowder? That's a connection that shows that he believes matter, no matter what it is the means to controlling the universe, his universe. And the judge, and this is what I love about the judge, everyone, and the McCarthy bros and people that like Judge Holden. Like, because when I first read him, I was like, okay, these are interesting thoughts. But he's really a trickster figure. I mean, he just is rambling away, because this isn't a Nietzschean conception of reality. People love to pin him in that, but Nietzsche didn't imagine Superman as a rambling warmonger. He saw that the dissolution of morality would give us more room for creativity. And this was something that was actually lost for a long time and has been recovered by like the Nietzschean community. I mean, because of the Nazis, the Nazis' weaponization of him, and others obviously gave him a black mark in history for a while. And it wasn't until shout out the postmodernists, like really looking at him and bringing him back into the light, that we can kind of see that aspect of Nietzsche, that it really isn't this kind of basic war is everything ideology. And obviously Cormac read Nietzsche and also knew that. And so like this Judge Holden isn't just some like Nietzschean fantasy from Cormac, obviously influenced a little bit by him. And the judge actually reverts to Christian morality and really Christian storytelling, because the judge views us as having original sin, and that the only way, obviously, in like Christian terms, to get rid of that is through baptism, following God. But God, the devil, Judge Holden, views his purification through war. Why do you think the Glanton gang bathes together and the blood turns bloody and gory? I mean, what do you think that was symbolizing in Blood Meridian? That was that was their sanctification from original sin. War is God and reality. The judge says, quote, "War is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will and the will of another within that larger will, which because it binds them is therefore forced to select. War is the ultimate game because war is at least a forcing of the unity of existence. War is God." And so Holden is actually very childish. This is a very dumb way to view violence. And this is actually more akin to fascism. What is fascism other than the spiritualization of the leader and of violence? And we're going deep here. The judge's pedophilia and McCarthy making him literally look like an infant. The guy looks like an infant. I mean, look, he's bald and big and has this big round face. It's because what do kids symbolize other than hope and possibility? They are the kids that will eventually grow up and see that he's being naive, see that he's being dumb. So that's why he's corrupting them and killing them and doing these things to them. And that's obviously an analogy to what fascism did with like Hitler Youth and all of that. And the judge is defeated eventually. And what is the judge defeated by? What is passive nihilism defeated by? And it is defeated by the collective effort of civilization. Why do you think the epilogue is of that? Because there is a new, as Patrick O'Connor says, a new Prometheus on the block. Patrick O'Connor says the holes that are being put into the ground are active negation, which, I mean, dude, that's some big brain stuff right there. That by putting a hole in the judge's blood meridian, they are actively negating through nothingness what he was trying to create. And that's what the epilogue is symbolizing. It's a push toward, a better future. And I don't know if we're there now, but it's talking about the endurance and the fight against nihilism, what we had to go through, what people in the West had to go through, and in other places of reality. Eventually, love wins. There is hope there. You can read it in different ways. You can see as like the end of the West being a bad thing, but we just heard about how the West was not a great place. Blood Meridian doesn't paint a very good picture for basically anybody who was living in that area at that time. And so civilization is bringing us something better, which once again is very interesting for McCarthy, because in The Orchard Keeper and in Suttree and in The Crossing, he kind of opposes that idea. But those were different books. In The Orchard Keeper, there wasn't violence going on. It was more calm, It was the loss of the land and the loss of us being able to have a little bit of freedom and expansiveness. The constrained reality, that I think McCarthy kind of favors. McCarthy, once again, everyone's always asking me, how do I know this? McCarthy is a conservative. He really puts a lot more liberal and environmentalist elements into his books. But from what he's said, which is basically, I'm a conservative, all his correspondences and influences in the archive, he believes in a somewhat limited government, because he doesn't believe, obviously, in anarchy because of like the road, right? Like that's a depiction of what happens when there's too much. But he also opposes like too much government, because that's what we are shown in The Orchard Keeper and like all these things. So, limited government. So in further videos, I'm going to do a Jungian interpretation of Judge Holden, a theological one, a lot of other ones. I'll just cap this one here. I don't want this to turn into 4 hours. But if you guys like this video and want to see more on Judge Holden, I can just continue on with all the little frameworks I know in my head. And then we can re-imply them ad infinitum to all the other characters and aspects of McCarthy novels. So Give this a like if you liked it. Comment on it to help me in the algorithm because, I'm going to lose to Wendy Goon and all those other guys. But maybe one day I'll have my own place in the algorithm. Peace, everyone.